Well, hi, everybody, and welcome to the Cultural Studies podcast. My name is Toby Miller, and my guest today is.
Michael Palm. Hi, Toby. I'm an associate professor of cultural studies and media and technology studies at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where I also serve as the president of our chapter of the American Association of University Professors.
And since that's a public university, does it have formal recognition for bargaining purposes as a union?
It absolutely does not. And North Carolina is one of many states in the US, including most in the southern US, that is known as what's called a right to work state, which
Which is right to get screwed over state.
yes, which basically means the right not to form a union.
Yeah.
So we are affiliated with the AFT, which is the American Federation of Teachers, but the AAUP is very much not a union, although it is a professional organization that
Mm.
advocates for academic freedom and for shared governance on campus. And as I know you're well aware, and I'm sure many of your listeners are too, the past year has been a very busy one for people invested in academic freedom or shared governance on campus in the US.
And worth noting for people that the reason I asked about the status of the AAUP is that the Supreme Court says that in private universities, faculty are so-called managerial employees and therefore don't have the right to unionize, though their employers may grant them that through the AAUP. The AAUP can therefore exist as, in a sense, an interest organization. But at some public universities, faculty can negotiate through it
Yes,
as a
and
recognized collective bargaining entity.
yes, for example, Rutgers University in New Jersey
Right.
is a very progressive and well-organized AAUP chapter that does have a contract and collective bargaining rights.
Right. And that's a public school, a big research one school like UNC is University of North Carolina, but it's in a state that is not as antipathetic to unions, shall we say,
Yeah,
as is the case with much of the South.
yeah, and since you mentioned that UNC Chapel, so UNC is a big statewide university system, not unlike the University of California system. There are 16 campuses throughout the UNC system here in North Carolina. And UNC Chapel Hill is what's known as the flagship, like Berkeley in the California system. And UNC Chapel Hill is one of a handful of Research One or R1 institutions in the UNC system. But this is kind of getting into the weeds of academic governance, but there are accreditation systems that universities have to apply to, every 5 or 10 years to keep that status. And North Carolina, along with several other southern states, most prominently Florida and Texas, are in the process of trying to essentially secede from the current accreditation systems and form what will, in all intents and purposes, be a new confederacy of higher education with their own accreditation system, which would probably mean, in practical purposes, the end of UNC as a Research One institution.
And The Guardian published a story 3 days ago about a survey that I think the AAUP had done on faculty fleeing Southern
Yeah,
universities.
yeah. I think 1 in 4 are actively trying to leave the South, and that I saw that article. I didn't read it with a very fine-tooth comb yet, but I can tell you that at UNC, not only because of some of those regional issues, but also some issues specific to North Carolina and specific to UNC, it's not just that faculty generally are trying to leave, but faculty of color are specifically trying to leave and are leaving and have left in droves in the past decade or so. I mean, it's a cynical joke, but I do like to joke that the the current governing boards for the University of North Carolina and certainly the elected officials in North Carolina are trying to turn the University of North Carolina into the University of White Carolina, and they're well on their way.
Prof. Michael, you may already have answered this opening gambit that wasn't the opening gambit with what you just shared with us. But I'm wondering, maybe you're going to talk about plant life or the cost of spectacles. Who knows? But could you share with us what's currently impeding, dynamizing, preoccupying, interesting you?
Sure, I'd be happy to. I guess I'll start by talking about what I am doing or trying to do in terms of my research and my teaching.
Hmm.
And then I'm sure at some point, without even trying, that will veer into what is inhibiting me or preoccupying me while I
Mm.
am trying to do that work. My primary research endeavor for an exceedingly long time now, has been a book, a monograph about the revived economy for vinyl records. And I've been conducting ethnographic research along the supply chains for records now for, believe it or not, a decade. And, I mean, that hasn't been consistent over the course of a decade, but it started a decade ago. And what I'm trying to do with that book is profile not the people who love records and listen to them and collect them, but the people whose jobs it is to make them or to sell them. And so it's really become a labor ethnography of this uh, niche sector of the music industry. But what's been fascinating about it is to realize that even though from a as a consumer product, records get a lot of attention for being this kind of analog exception in our digital world, but that the labor that goes into making and selling records is actually much more representative and much more instructive in terms of the types of challenges and constrictions that workers in any number of manufacturing sectors, retail sectors, and cultural sectors are facing. So the vinyl labor is much more representative of work today than, you know, listening to records maybe of other forms of consumption. So that's the primary research I've been, and I'm in the my research is largely finished, and I'm in the process of trying to draft that manuscript. And I think it might be worth saying in terms of your initial prompt that one of the reasons that it's taken me as long as it has to write this book, I should also admit that it's been a very enjoyable process, and I'm not really in any hurry to stop visiting record plants and record stores and being able to call it a site visit. But I conducted the bulk of the research in over 2 semesters. In the spring of 2019, I was awarded what at UNC is called a research and study assignment, which basically means that for a semester, I am relieved of my teaching responsibilities and my administrative responsibilities, serving on departmental committees. And I was awarded another one of those semesters this last semester, the spring of 2025. And it was really during those 2 semesters were the only times that I was able to really do a sustained amount of ethnographic research. So that's, kind of speaks to the constrictions of what is even, I mean, I have one of the best jobs in academia in terms of a tenured position at an R1 university with a 2-2 teaching load, 2 classes every semester. Very few faculty are as fortunate as I am, but even with that privilege, I still need those kind of special accommodations to carve out the time to do that kind of sustained research. So I've been very fortunate that it's allowed this kind of, I think, what I've learned to call longitudinal study of, taking a long time to conduct it. But anyway, that's the primary research endeavor I've been involved in. As far as teaching goes, One project that I'm currently in a much earlier stage of that is relevant to the podcast is that I have recently stepped into the role of administering the cultural studies program in my department, which is the Department of Communication at UNC Chapel Hill. And that is largely an administrative role, which means helping PhD students who want to obtain a certificate in cultural studies or working with a handful of undergraduate students who are pursuing a more specific and interdisciplinary major in cultural studies rather than in communication. But as part of that new role as the director of the cultural studies program, I am for the first time teaching the cultural studies course in our undergraduate curriculum, which is an intermediate level course called Practices of Cultural Studies. And teaching any new class for the first time is very challenging and exciting, but particularly that class in this moment, that has been a real learning experience for me.
I've interviewed a number of people for the podcast series in the last year. For the first time, as in China, people in the South, in some cases, specifically those without tenure, have asked me not to ask anything about politics in the recording because they're frightened, as are people in China,
Yeah,
of what may happen should they respond. So I think that's a very real concern. Uh, and of course, workloads are often increasing, though, as you say, compared to the majority of university teaching in the United States, which is undertaken on a casualized basis, or people with heavier workloads than yours. You know, you are, as you say, in a sense, in a privileged position, but the workload
extremely.
is increasing, the
Hmm.
political pressures are multiplying, and in addition to all of that, you are dedicating yourself to the interests of the faculty as a collective and individual body through AAUP. By the way, some people may have heard me clapping and may hear me clap again. This is because I'm trying to kill the mosquitoes that are trying to kill me where I am. Here is a major center for mosquito-borne fatal diseases. And unfortunately, I have the right levels of CO2 emanating from my body to appeal to the critters. So the applause is deserved on Michael's part, but is not, in this case, animated thereby. So getting on to this question, now that I've had my little rant of the ethnography, how and where did you do this? Where did you go and how did you get entree?
So the workplaces where I've been conducting site visits are have been very varied because the supply chains for manufacturing vinyl records are very varied. Um, there are three primary operations that records undergo during their fabrication. And at those three sites resemble the first one is a mastering studio, which is, very much an artistic workplace. The second one is an electroplating facility where the metal discs that are used to stamp records are made, and those facilities more resemble laboratories. They involve nickel baths and silver sprays, and it's an intensely chemical process. And then the third primary stage are the pressing plants themselves, and those are old-fashioned factories by and large. They've been imbued with an artisanal ethos in our digital era, but those have been three of the primary work sites that I've gone to on the manufacturing side of my research. But then I've also been spending time in not only record stores, which in this era are seldom just record stores, but usually have very sophisticated distribution networks that entail their shipping records around the world. And so they are often warehouses associated with those stores, where the actual shop floor is a very small portion of the business, and most of the workers are in offices or warehouses doing other things. I've also gone to record labels, offices, and music distributors, warehouses, and facilities. As far as the entree goes, I have been uh, pleasantly surprised, or I guess after this many years, no longer really surprised at how open almost all of these workplaces have been. I think that there is, uh, I mean, I think generally people are um, flattered when you find their work interesting and important enough to study and to write up. And there's a kind of general receptivity. But I think the other thing that has been really eye-opening for me is the scale from very small, literally mom and pop independent companies that comprise most of the companies that I have been studying, and then also that just kind of ethically and politically my interests gravitate toward. But there are also at various points along the supply chains large multinational global corporations, and they've been accommodating in terms of interviews with their CEOs or their chief sustainability officers or whatever the case may be. But they're obviously more guarded. They have different rules and policies around recording interviews or access to their facilities. But with a few exceptions, the companies and the people that I've talked to have been incredibly open, incredibly welcoming. The only ones that haven't, other than the massive MNCs, have been a handful of companies with a lot of proprietary data online that they're much more guarded about somebody writing about their business operations than the other companies have been. So that has been interesting to realize. But again, like I said, kind of an example of how this, outlier in terms of its materiality among digital culture actually resembles other economic sectors and other types of work, in the culture industries today.
And the laboratory factories, where are they?
Well, the factories are pretty well spread throughout the US. There has really been a flowering of small independent pressing plants, and they tend to be in cities or areas where there is already a vibrant and very well established music scene. Right. So there's the one that I've been spending the most time in is in Chicago. There's one in Minneapolis. There's one in Cleveland. They're not necessarily clustered in, New York and LA like you might expect because of that, I think, network of independent production that very much mirrors the history of independent music in terms of indie labels in the US. When it comes to the laboratories and where the more toxic and resource intensive parts of the manufacturing are done, those tend to be um, near those same cities, but often on the outskirts where environmental regulations are maybe not as strict as they might be. So for example, the oldest and probably most venerable plating facility in the U.S. is in Elizabeth, New Jersey, where it's very close to New York City, but not subject to the environmental regulations of New York City, but rather those of New Jersey, which infamously are
Les,
more
I
lax.
I remember in the glory days, in inverted commas, of World Championship Wrestling, it was located in New Jersey rather than New York because New Jersey was prepared to define wrestling as entertainment, not sports,
Mhm.
and hence did not have the same requirements for medical participation in events, and hence you didn't have to pay doctors. So,
Yeah,
um, in terms of health issues, then, how are the occupational health and safety questions for the people working in the laboratory side of this?
they are under fairly strict OSHA regulations, and the plating facilities do get regular visits from EPA inspectors. Um, and so
Environmental Protection
I
Agency.
guess there's a yes, sorry, thank you. Um, and there's a couple sides to this. One does have to do with exposure to, um, materials that can be toxic, and records are made from a plastic compound, and fabricating them into records does involve heating them to extreme temperatures, and so there are certainly risks involved in terms of exposure to chemicals, inhalation, those types of issues. But there's also, I think more informally, I suppose, just the fact that a lot of these jobs are very physically demanding. And I'm, routinely reminded of this when I spend a day, not even in a record plant, but even in a record store, just how much harder these people work than I do, sitting at my desk or standing in front of a, lecture podium for a couple hours a day. I'm invariably exhausted at the end of one of my site visits. It's very fun and exciting, but a lot more demanding just at the level of bones and muscles.
Absolutely. And if I could go on to the demand side of this, as it were, when I read about the recrudescence of interest in vinyl recordings or vinyl distribution of music, the word I keep reading is warmth or warm. What is this? What does this mean? Any ideas?
Yeah, I think, I guess the first thing I want to say is that, I think one of the things that drove me to focus on the labor rather than the consumption of vinyl
Hmm.
was not wanting to proselytize for a superior.
Warmth.
Yes. Well, no, but that's the thing is there are differences between listening to a record and listening to an MP3 or to
Hmm.
a stream of music. And I think the thing to bear in mind is that that purported warmth is there are technological reasons for it, but it's culturally coded, right? And so in 1969, nobody celebrated the warmth of their vinyl recordings, right? When that was the default method for listening to music. So, I think so both in terms of the consumption and what I've been finding in terms of the labor, that there are these very contingent and contextual and historically specific reasons for how an experience, whether it's a work experience or a consumer experience, get coded in relation to one another. So, and another point that might be worth making in this regard, in terms of my focus on the labor, is that part of that warmth has to do with the imperfections, the clicks, the pops,
Mm.
that Benjaminian aura that accrues to a vinyl record, which is ironic, right? Since he was talking about the aura of, handmade art in distinction from mechanically reproduced art. And records are mass produced, are mechanically reproduced, but now they've come in to be recognized for having that type of aura, that type of warmth that you're talking
Mm.
to.
Mm.
But those imperfections they're literally unavoidable in the production process. Even if a million records are made of the same album, each one of those records is technically unique in terms of its microscopic idiosyncrasies and imperfections. And that's where I think that culturally coded warmth comes from. But
Mm.
that also drives the people who make records crazy. Like that's their Sisyphusian, task, right? Is trying to overcome all of those
All
imperfections
those things.
that are so charming to listeners.
Now, my guess is that if we went back and looked at record reviews from 50 years ago, we might find the words warm and warmth, but that would refer to recording studios and
Yes,
the impact they might have on or not necessarily perhaps performance, but also recording itself. And also some concert halls for classical music would be given that kind of term, descriptor in a positive sense. But in general terms, about the mere fact of listening to vinyl, I
right.
suspect that's really the recrudescence in the last 15 years. Would that be the period?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that,
Yeah.
um, yeah. And I think it is, it's worth noting that, it was like reel to reel tapes were the kind of audiophile,
Mm.
experience for music back when, everybody collected records or at least bought records if you wanted to listen to music. And I think, what you're pointing to in terms of recording studios and various rooms, this just the most recent site visit I did was to a record press, a record plant in Chicago called Smash Plastic. And when they're doing quality control, they're not listening to the music, right? They're listening to the record itself.
Yes.
And as they're well aware, all they can do is make it worse. They can't improve the recording that they're getting. So one of the press operators was telling me that when he's listening to, one of the records that they've pressed, to check it for quality, what he's listening for is the room sound, the ambient noise from the recording, because he figures if he can hear that, then that means that the record itself is quiet enough that they're not interfering with that warmth, if you will, from the recording studio itself.
By the way, folks, Prof M is doing a heroic job of not laughing as I plaster myself with insect repellent in order to try to avoid dengue, which is a
I
very
wish I wish the listeners could see the backdrop behind you though. It's incredibly florid and beautiful and green and
and fantastic for dengue. Uh,
yeah.
but no, that's fascinating because I think those sorts of concepts do apply. And I want to talk in a moment about your first book, which is in fact about the hinge, the liminal condition between consumption and labor. But before we get on to that, could I ask you, given that, again, I know this is more on the demand side of what you're doing, what
Mhm.
stimulated this renewed interest in vinyl, would you say? What were people getting sick of in through their CDs or later their MP3 versions of music they loved? And
Well,
I
I would say
I've just moved back to Mexico from Spain, and I know I haven't looked around here, but in Spain I went to lots of music shops, electronic shops, and so on, and it's not cheap to buy a record player. It's an
no, or to buy a
expensive
record.
taste.
Yes.
Ah, or to buy a record. I didn't know that. Uh-huh. Yeah.
Yeah, no, there's a at least in the record world, there's a famous cartoon from the New Yorker in 2015 where two balding, bespectacled, middle-aged white guys like me are standing in front of a high-end stereo. Yeah, there you go. They're standing in front of their high-end stereo and record collection, and one of them is saying to the other, the two things that really drew me back to vinyl were the expense and the inconvenience. And, I think to answer your question in a word, it was streaming. So it wasn't just, see, because CDs and MP3s, you can still collect those. And so, the key hinge in terms of stimulating the demand was not the move from analog to digital, it was the move from ownership to access as the way that people engaged music.
Yes.
So, CDs, you can argue about whether they're sonically better than records or not. They're smaller, so the metadata, the cover art, the liner notes, all of that might be compromised, but you still purchase them, you still acquire them, you can still put them on your shelf and show them to your friends, which is a lot harder to do with a Spotify playlist, right? And so there's, the data is absolutely clear that when streaming replaced MP3s as the primary mode of listening to music, that's when you see vinyl reemerge as a blip on the sales charts put out by Billboard or the Recording Industry
Mm,
Association, whatever the RIAA
mm,
stands
mm.
for. And so, that the working title for the intro of my book is Islands in the Stream because of that pretty direct correlation between streaming and the reemergence of records.
Interesting. Could we turn now, Prof, to that first book? Uh,
Sure.
it's so valuable, such a landmark piece of work, in my opinion, in this issue of consumption and labor being connected within the same body. Could you share with us a little bit about that? And in particular, this is because you touched there, or one of your key elements there is a subject that 20, 25 years ago would send students to sleep. If you ask them about local government or distribution or telephony, Now, telephony is the only thing they're interested in, though they don't know what the word is. So share with us, if you would, how the humble telephone, now so incredibly interesting apparently, actually is central to this question of auto labor.
Yeah, no, I should start by just prefacing this by saying that Professor Miller was a formative influence on the development of my this research, which was my dissertation research, and then became my first book about the history of self-service and the use of the telephone to reorganize what had been jobs or paid tasks into, unpaid, chores or everyday labor for consumers. So, um, the first book is called Technologies of Consumer Labor: A History of Self-Service, and it's focused on how the career of the telephone, not the cell phone or smartphone, but the old, landline, as we now call it, was central in this reorganization, redistribution of paid labor into everyday tasks, unpaid, domestic labor, work for consumers. And I think there's a couple key moments in that history that I focus the chapters on.
Mm-hmm.
The first is the emergence of self-service as a concept, which actually has nothing to do with telephones and was part and parcel of the rise of supermarkets and the kind of economies of scale that turned, grocery stores and bodegas and corner stores into supermarkets. And the only way to make those viable was to offload a lot of the labor costs onto consumers and convince them that they were trading that work in exchange for savings in the prices of the goods for sale in supermarkets. So that kind of establishment of the idea was the first chapter and the first moment that I focus on. The second one is a more familiar story to at least historians of telephony, which was when operators were rendered obsolete by rotary telephone dials. And that is kind of that's the moment when telephone users became accustomed to establishing their own telecommunication connection, which is not something that we even think about doing anymore, but we do every time we, wake up our smartphone or open our laptop. But there was a time when we asked someone to do that for us. I think maybe the more innovative moment that I was able to identify in that history was a chapter that was devoted to when rotary dials were replaced by touchtone keypads.
Mm.
And that is kind of a, something of a black hole in the history of telephone research. But that was the kind of originary moment for the digitization of telephony. And by digitization here, I don't just mean the ones and zeros of binary code as opposed to copper wires, but the digitization in terms of using our fingers to punch information into our phones beyond just a telephone number or, dialing zero to get the operator. And so that really becomes this explosive moment that you can trace back all of the type of communication, whether it's text messaging or entering passcodes or um, using keypads and keyboards for any number of types of communication today. And Toby, you're absolutely right that when I started doing that research in the mid 20 in the first few years of the 21st century, it was largely a historical project. And then thanks in no small part to the iPhone dropping in 2008, all of a sudden I had a brand new conclusion to write, and it became this history of the present, right? And I like to joke that if it weren't for smartphones and for the iPhone in particular in 2008, there's no way I would have gotten the job that I got at UNC that year, the same year that the iPhone dropped.
I think of pumping gas as crucial to this too. As you may know, where I live, there are still people who work the petrol pump for you.
Yeah. Speaking of New Jersey, one of, I think, two states in the US where that is still the case.
Oh, I didn't know it was still the case because basically what happened in the global north pretty quickly after the oil price crisis of 73 is that the companies involved, the top multinational corporations, decided that they would pass this on to the consumer as a quick way of cutting their own costs. And actually, the appalling lapsed Trotskyite but ongoing Reaganite Alvin Toffler is one of the people who recognized this in the mid 70s.
Mhm.
A quick comment on the rotary phone. My two memories of that are how it hurt your fingers if you had to dial a lot of calls, and how that led, therefore, to people using pencils to
Yeah,
do the dialing, which then led to the invisibility of the number that of each number in each hole of the rotary phone
being literally erased.
system, literally erased or covered over with
Yeah.
darkness. And then the other thing I remember was when the attempt was made in the late 60s, early 70s to make these things hip, there would be the design that you may recall or will have seen in your research, akin to what women wore mostly when they were putting through calls, and which people still use today in call centers, which is the shape of the thing would meld with your head, though it wasn't attached to your head. But then the fatal error in this was that there was no longer a cradle for these
Hmm.
phones. Instead, you put them down. Well, the problem was you would put them down and keep talking and then end the call by mistake. So, just for younger listeners, that's a fascinating anecdote that shows what a rich life I've led, that I can still remember things like that. So, this issue then of telephony as a model for free labor undertaken on the part of inverted commas consumers is something that can be applied to a myriad of things now. The number seems to be increasing all the time. Is that fair to say?
Oh, absolutely. And I think what's become, I think those types of work transfers, if you will, from
Mm,
a paid worker to an unpaid consumer has become expected, no doubt about it. And I think what you see as well is the reinscription of what were once basic services as somehow elite or luxury or first class services. So you can still get someone to do these basic tasks for you, but it's going to cost you a lot of money, or it's going to require some kind of elite membership, with your gas station or your airline or whatever,
mm.
service supplier or goods supplier.
And this also relates, I guess, to problems and increased precariousness for people in quasi-proletarian aspects of the culture industries, just as it does for people outside the states you mentioned. I had no idea. In the petroleum or gas industry at the consumer end of sales and services. And one of the things that's predicted for artificial intelligence and is already happening, as you know, is as a quote labor saving device for companies, which are already laying people off at the low end, the middle end, but of course not yet the high end.
Yeah, and I think, I guess a couple comments. I think, I mean, this is just off the top of my head. I haven't researched this or anything, but I do think is there is a historical angle from which to approach the gig economy,
Mm,
and thinking about the ways that always unilateral transfer from workers to consumers who do them without being paid, but that often some of these same types of tasks, whether it's, going back to the formative example of self-service, grocery shopping, or various types of delivery, where both the work itself and the absorption of costs for the resources, primarily a car, are offloaded onto more precarious proletarianized workers, like you said. So it's a more complicated landscape of reorganization of those tasks, but there is certainly a through line in terms of the profit or surplus value or whatever being extracted from the top, whether it's through, historically the way that those reorganizations are marketed or, more recently the way that they're mediated.
One of the little bastards just flew onto the screen and settled
I
for a
saw
moment.
that one.
But
Yeah,
as
you're
you
in danger.
clearly hasn't eaten me recently and is therefore moving fast. As you know, when they've just supped on you, they're sort of sleepy, a bit like a post-orgasm moment. You know,
Yeah, that one was moving though. He's
that
still
was
hungry.
moving fast. And it was said Muhammad Ali was capable of catching a bird in his hand when it was flying by, given his quickness
Impressive.
and his
Yeah.
brilliance. But I wasn't showing Ali-like reflexes there. Prof P, I wanted to ask you one last question, if I may, and then hand over to you the opportunity after you've answered it to add anything or perhaps subtract something from what you've said. And that might involve, going back over something we've covered where you want to offer a bit more, or it might be that there's an area that we haven't ranged across where you'd like to say something. Does that sound all right as a means of bringing things to a gentlemanly close?
Absolutely.
So my last question is a bit personal, old thing.
Okay.
My recollection, and it's hazy, is that somewhere, but I couldn't find it when I was going through the digital trace of your life available to me. You wrote about sports and your father.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now,
I
did you
think that may
publish
have
that, or is
been,
that a private discussion in a beer hall that I shouldn't be sharing?
no, it's all fair game. I think, as I recall, in a graduate seminar on cultural citizenship, taught by the esteemed Professor Miller, I believe I wrote a paper about the racialized policing of professional athletes. And I opened that paper with an anecdote about ESPN's like sports century, athletes of the century countdown that came down to the aforementioned Muhammad Ali and Michael Jordan as the last two. And my father, for any number of reasons involving his participation in the Vietnam War, his residency in Chicago, his investment in American capitalism, was passionately and almost angrily, I guess we could say rooting for Michael Jordan to win this completely insignificant and arbitrary, list that ESPN was coming up with around the fin de siècle. And I use that as an opening anecdote to talk about how black male athletes specifically were being policed culturally.
Right. So I apologize for raising something that wasn't published, but something that I read many, many years ago. But thank you for answering and doing so evocatively. ESPN, by the way, folks, stands for Entertainment and Sports Programming Network, or Entertainment
Yes,
and Sports Network. And
part of
originally,
the Disney empire.
right, originally, as was the case with A&E, which stood for Arts and Entertainment, this was conceived of not as what it became, in this case, purely a sports network, but as something that would blend all kinds of different forms of popular culture, with sports perhaps most prominent. It's interesting to see those first years of deregulation of American television, as in US television, leading to the creation of various marks or brands that actually were quite misleading in terms of what happened to this world. So Bravo called itself jazz as one of its, big taglines. And
Yeah, yeah, I'd
I'm
forgotten
not
that.
seeing a lot of that. It became a reality TV network. In any event, Prof, to close things off, I wanted to, as I said earlier, wanted to invite you either to revisit something that we've touched on where you want to add something, or if there's terrain that we haven't traversed, to do so now.
I think the only thing I would add is that, I mentioned that I might have, two answers to your question about bringing this history of self-service and technological
Mm,
reorganizations of work into the future. And I only mentioned the one. The second one might bring it back full circle to our discussion of UNC Chapel Hill and the political climate we find ourselves in, that are the governing bodies, the politically appointed officials who oversee the UNC system have been uh, trying to find ways to use AI to scrape the syllabuses of UNC faculty to monitor them to make sure that we're not teaching woke subjects or DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, in violation of our great leaders' orders. And so
mm.
that might just be a kind of harrowing but significant note to leave the listeners with.
Absolutely. It's interesting. Years ago, I've always refused to allow universities to have digital copies of what I teach or to record anything. But I didn't do it for political reasons. I did it for economic ones because they
Mm.
want to be able to use that to then claim money from anything you publish that relates to
Mhm.
that. And, we're not work for hire, fortunately, under the Copyright Act, at least for the moment. Well, Prof. Michael, thank you so much. You began with a resounding note of hope and promise, and you ended the same way. But in between, we were able to talk about telephony in one of the most engaging and fascinating ways that people born in the 21st century will ever know.
We've done them a great service.
We have. And so modestly, I think, too. But in all seriousness, your work is great. That first book that we've adumbrated, or you've adumbrated, is wonderful. And I'm excited to see the fruits of the product of the second book. You've published some articles related to that already,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
I'll give a link in the notes to the website at UNC so people can follow up on that. But I'm sure the book will be another landmark when it appears.
Well, thank you. That's very nice of you to say, and it's genuinely a pleasure to talk to you. Like I said, somebody who is one of the most formative influences on me, and great to see you again. And I hope you survive the insect invasion there.